In October of 2009, a bank officer named Gerald Pruitt drove a county road in Cass County, Nebraska, with a printout of comparable sales on the seat beside him, and a foreclosure notice already signed in his breast pocket. He found the farmhouse set back from the road on a gravel lane, knocked twice, and told Maren Dahl, then 54 years old, that the institution he represented had reviewed the operation's balance sheet and found it insufficiently collateralized. Her 600 acres, he said, were going to auction on the 14th of November. He was not unkind about it. He straightened his collar in the cold, told her the bank wished the situation had resolved differently, and returned to his sedan without looking back at the barn. By the time that auction ended, Maren Dahl owned 742 acres. She did not explain herself to Gerald Pruitt that day. She did not speak to the reporters who came later, or to the extension agents who asked for a site visit, or to the 3 university agronomists who wrote letters. What she did was drive 40 minutes home, put water on the stove, and sit at the kitchen table with her grandmother's ledger open in front of her, the one that ran from 1931 to 1961 in pencil, so faint you had to tip it toward a lamp to read. She had been reading that ledger for 30 years. She planned to read it for 30 more. This is the story of how a woman the county considered finished turned out to be more solvent than the bank that came to collect her. In 1978, Maren Dahl was 23 years old, freshly married, freshly returned from 2 years at a community college in Omaha, where she had studied accounting, and she had come back to Cass County to help her grandmother, Lotta Dahl, run the place Lotta had worked since 1941. Lotta was then 79. She moved slowly and used a cane she had cut herself from a hickory branch, and she had strong opinions about soil moisture that she could not always explain in terms a county agent would accept, but which had kept 600 acres of river-bottom ground in production through the dry years of the 1950s and the price collapse of the 1960s. Maren had always believed her grandmother. She had not always known exactly why. The farm carried mixed enterprise from the beginning. Winter wheat and dryland corn in the low fields, a small herd of 60 Hereford cross cattle on the higher timber-edge ground, a 3-acre kitchen garden that Lotta ran with the same methodical seriousness she applied to everything, and a pasture rotation system that Lotta had designed herself, refining it each season and recording the results in the ledger in columns of yield, rainfall, and days grazed that stretched across 30 years of weather. She did not call it rotational grazing. She called it giving the ground time to think. Gerald Pruitt was 28 when he first visited the Dahl place in 2001. He was an agricultural loan officer for a regional bank headquartered in Lincoln, and he had driven out at the request of Maren's husband, Carl, who had died of a heart attack 18 months before, leaving Maren alone with $214,000 in operating debt, 3 hired men she could not afford to keep, and 600 acres she had no intention of surrendering. Gerald arrived in a pressed tan shirt with his bank's logo above the pocket and a laptop bag he carried from the car, with the careful posture of a man who had been told not to set it in mud. He was not a bad man. He had grown up in Lincoln and believed sincerely that agriculture worked best at scale, that thin-margin mixed operations were a relic of a period before input efficiency had matured, and that a woman running a mixed farm, alone in her mid-40s, on a balance sheet that thin was, in his considered professional judgment, a sentimental exercise. He said it more gently than that, of course. He talked about debt service ratios and portfolio risk and what the comparable monoculture operations in the county were returning per acre. He looked at Marin's columns, at the cattle numbers and the wheat yields and the grazing logs, and he told her the operation lacked economies of scale and that she should consider liquidating the herd, converting to continuous corn, and refinancing at a rate that would give her 5 years to stabilize. He used the word stabilize 3 times. When she did not respond immediately, he said, quietly and not unkindly, that he understood sentimentality about the family land, but that sentimentality was a luxury the balance sheet at present could not support. My grandmother pulled 38 bushels of wheat per acre in 1956, Marin said. Dry year. County average was 22. Gerald nodded and made a note on his laptop. He thanked her for her time and said he would follow up with a modified loan proposal. On the drive back to Lincoln, he dictated a memo to his assistant, noting the operation as a high-risk emotional holdout. He filed it under legacy cases. Let me tell you what Lotta Dahl's ledger actually contained, because it is the thing that made the difference, and without understanding what it recorded, the auction outcome in 2009 reads as luck instead of arithmetic. Lotta had begun keeping her records in 1931 with her father-in-law's system and had departed from it almost immediately. Where he tracked yields by field and year, she tracked yields by field, year, and the grazing that had preceded them. She divided the home place into 9 paddocks, moved her small cattle herd on a schedule she adjusted each spring based on how long the grass needed to reach what she called its working height, roughly 12 inches, and how long it needed to rest after the cattle had grazed it down to 4. She recorded the rest periods in days and the subsequent wheat yields in bushels per acre in adjacent columns. 30 years of paired data. The physical object was a ledger she had purchased at the hardware store in Plattsmouth, a 100-page ruled book with a red cloth cover that had faded to coral and a brass clasp that no longer latched. She wrote in pencil because, she told Marin once, ink made you feel like you had finished thinking. Each page held 6 columns. The first was the paddock number. The second was the date the cattle entered it. The third was the date they left, and adjacent to that, in Lotta's cramped notation, the average grass height she estimated at entry and at departure, in inches. The 5th column was the rest period in days before the adjacent wheat field was planted. The 6th was the wheat yield at harvest. What those columns showed, if you read them without skipping, was a phenomenon soil scientists would eventually term the hydraulic lift effect of deep-rooted perennial grasses. Lotta did not know that name. She knew that ground with a long rest period grew grass with longer roots, that longer roots pulled moisture from deeper in the soil profile during drought, and that the same deep root mass, when it died back and decomposed, left channels in the soil that rainwater followed down rather than running off. She knew this because she had watched it for 30 years and written down what she saw. She also knew that the cattle, in their passing, pressed organic matter into the soil surface and left behind a manure that broke down slowly through winter and released nitrogen the following spring, at the same rate the young wheat plants needed it, neither too fast nor too slow. The timing calibrated, not by a laboratory, but by the decades of observation she had already committed to the ledger. The wheat fields adjacent to the paddocks, with the longest rest periods, consistently outperformed the county average by between 8 and 14 bushels per acre. And they did it most dramatically in the dry years, when the county average fell and hers held. The 1956 growing season is the clearest example. Cass County received 6.3 inches of rainfall between April and July against a historical average of 12.8. The county wheat average that year came in at 22 bushels per acre, which was considered acceptable given the conditions. Lotta's wheat came in at 38 bushels per acre. The extension agent who visited that fall to document the anomaly wrote in his notes that the field showed unusual moisture retention and asked Lotta what she had applied. She showed him the ledger. He thanked her politely and wrote in his report that the operator attributed results to a grazing management system, notation pending further review. The further review never came. The ledger sat on the kitchen shelf. Gerald Pruitt's proposal was that she should eliminate the cattle, eliminate the paddock system, and plant continuous corn. Continuous corn in Cass County was returning 165 bushels per acre at conventional input levels. It was, on a single-year basis, a better number than her wheat. What his analysis did not account for was that continuous corn on ground, without the organic matter cycle she had maintained for 60 years, would compact, crust, and shed rainfall at an increasing rate, that her input costs would rise as the soil biology degraded, and that in a drought year, her sandy loam would lose moisture faster than ground with the root architecture Lotta had built. She did not explain any of this to Gerald in 2001. She simply declined his proposal, renegotiated a smaller operating line, and kept working. Her granddaughter Clara arrived in the spring of 2005. She was 24. She had a degree in agricultural business from the University of Nebraska, and she had come home for a summer to help. She planned to spend 2 years, then take a position at an agribusiness consulting firm in Omaha that had already offered it. She brought her laptop and a copy of a USDA efficiency report and a polite but clear conviction that her grandmother's operation was a romantic attachment to a past that had been superseded by better science. Clara was not wrong to think this, at least not by the standards of what she had been taught. Her degree program had used case studies from consolidated grain operations in the Corn Belt, and the case studies all pointed toward the same conclusion. Mixed enterprise was a legacy structure, viable in the mid-20th century, when labor was cheap and inputs were minimal, but superseded by the input efficiency revolution of the 1970s and 1980s that had made monoculture the rational default for any farm that had to service debt in a commodity market. She had graduated with honors. She believed what her courses had taught her, the way a person believes something they have learned, from a source they had every reason to trust. She spent her first 2 weeks walking the fields with Maren, asking questions, writing things in a small notebook. She attended the paddock moves, watched Maren read the grass height with her boot toe, watched her count days on the fence posts where she kept a running tally in chalk. On the third Saturday, she sat at the kitchen table after supper, with a ledger open in front of her, and worked through the columns with a calculator for 2 hours. "The rotation system is interesting," she said. She said it the way a person says interesting when they mean inefficient. The input costs on the cattle are eating your margin. If you converted those acres to cash crop and leased out the pasture, you'd stabilize the balance sheet. There was that word again. Maren turned the ledger so Clara could see the 1956 column, then 1957, then the 1959 drought year, then 1960. She did not say anything. She let the numbers speak in the order Lotta had recorded them. The county average in the penciled margin note from the extension report Lotta had stapled to each year's page, and the doll yield beside it, year after year, the gap narrowest in wet years and widest when the ground was dry. Clara looked at them for a long time without speaking. "Why is yours different?" she said. "That's the question," Maren said. Clara did not leave for Omaha in the fall of 2005. She sent a polite note to the consulting firm, and enrolled in a graduate program in soil science at Lincoln instead. She came home on weekends and walked the paddocks with Marin and read the ledger. She measured root depths in the paddocks with the longest rest periods and compared them to a test plot she established on ground that had been in continuous wheat without grazing for 8 years. The difference was 11 inches of root penetration on average, which corresponded in her measurements to access to a deeper moisture horizon that held water through July and into August, when the surface soil had already dried. She submitted these findings in a preliminary paper her advisor called the most rigorous first-year fieldwork he had reviewed in a decade. She finished her degree in 2007, wrote her thesis on deep-root hydraulic effects in mixed cattle and grain operations, and had it cited in a USDA extension bulletin 2 years later, without anyone at the bank knowing it existed. In 2006, Gerald Pruitt returned to the Dahl place for what would be his second visit. He had been promoted and was now managing the agricultural portfolio for the region, which meant he reviewed more accounts more quickly and had less time to read the details. He pulled onto the gravel lane in a newer sedan, this one with a company plate, and carried a tablet under his arm instead of a laptop bag. He was efficient and organized and perfectly pleasant. He sat at the kitchen table, reviewed the current balance sheet on his screen, noted the operating debt had not materially reduced in 5 years, and reiterated his recommendation. Convert to continuous corn, liquidate the herd, refinance at a term that could be serviced on a monoculture income. He was cheerful and professional about it. He noted that corn futures were looking strong through 2008 and that the bank's preferred clients in the county were posting very good numbers. He mentioned a neighbor named Tom Breckenridge, who farmed 1,100 acres of continuous corn 2 miles west, and had recently financed a new self-propelled combine at $380,000 and a grain bin complex at $210,000. Tom was, Gerald said, an example of what modern operation looked like. He paused after he said it, in case Marin wanted to respond. She did not respond. He added that the bank would be happy to structure something similar for her if she wanted to explore the conversation. And she thanked him for his time and walked him to the door. Marin thanked him for his time. Tom Breckenridge was a good man. He had farmed since he was 19. He served on the county's Soil and Water Board, and he genuinely believed that the path Gerald had described was the only one that made arithmetic sense for small operators trying to compete in a commodity market. He had borrowed heavily to build his capacity, but the margin per bushel at 2006 prices supported the debt service, barely, and the projections Gerald had shown him extended that margin through 2012. Tom drove the new combine himself on the first day and ran it from first light until the cab lights were the only illumination left on the field. And he was proud of it in the way a man is proud of something he worked a long time to afford. He was also, in the fall and winter of 2006 and 2007, spending $68 per acre on herbicide, $54 per acre on synthetic nitrogen, and $22 per acre on fungicide applications, because 2 seasons of continuous corn on the same ground had begun stripping the soil of its biological buffering capacity. And he was compensating with chemistry. The application totals appeared on his input ledger in a column he reviewed each spring and found, each spring, slightly larger than the year before. He asked his agronomist about it. The agronomist, a man named Dale who worked for the chemical input distributor, told him the increases were normal for ground in its 3rd and 4th year of continuous corn, that the soil was establishing a new equilibrium, and that the input level should stabilize around year 6. Tom noted this and continued. Marin's input costs in those same 2 years were $31 per acre on her wheat ground, because the pasture rotation maintained the organic matter that buffered soil pH and retained applied nitrogen, and because the cattle provided 60% of her nitrogen requirement at no cash cost beyond management. She was not competing with Tom Breckenridge on volume. She was not trying to. She was in a different market, under a different contract, selling a product the commodity elevator had no price for, and her input ledger ran in the opposite direction from Tom's, narrowing each year as the soil continued to improve rather than widening each year as it declined. The summer of 2007 was dry. Not catastrophically dry, not a drought year in the formal sense, but dry enough that the county wheat average dropped from 43 bushels per acre to 31. Marin's wheat came in at 39. She said nothing about it at the elevator when she delivered, not to the operator and not to the farmer ahead of her in line who was shaking his head at his own ticket. She drove home, recorded the number in the ledger in the column next to 1956, and made supper. The summer of 2008 was not dry. It was wet in April and May, and then abruptly dry in June when the corn was in its vegetative stage and needed moisture most, and then wet again in August when moisture encourages fungal disease in corn that has been stressed. That sequence, a dry stress period followed by wet conditions, is the sequence that most reliably encourages gray leaf spot and Goss's wilt in continuous corn, and does nothing kind to ground that has lost its drainage architecture and is therefore holding excess moisture against the root zone at the wrong moment. Tom Breckenridge walked his fields in July and saw the lesions beginning on the lower leaves, the narrow tan stripes running parallel to the leaf margin. He called Dale, his agronomist from the input company. Dale recommended an additional fungicide pass at $18 per acre. Tom applied it. It was not enough. Tom lost 18% of his crop to gray leaf spot and root lodging by harvest. His per-acre yield fell to 138 bushels on ground that had been projecting 170. His per-acre return dropped below his break-even at full input cost, and because his debt service on the combine and the grain bins required a specific monthly cash flow to stay current, he called the bank in October and applied for a bridge loan to carry him through to the following season. Gerald Pruitt reviewed the account, saw that the 2008 losses were weather-related and therefore temporary, saw that Tom's underlying operation was strong on paper and that his acreage base was sound, and approved the bridge at a rate of 6.4%. It was, at the time, a routine extension in a year when weather losses had stressed multiple portfolios across the region. In 2008 and into 2009, corn futures dropped from $7.64 a bushel at their 2008 peak to under $3.90 by the spring of 2009, driven by the commodity market correction that followed the financial crisis and a global supply adjustment that the projections Gerald had used in his client conversations had not modeled. Gerald's portfolio was under stress at multiple accounts. His institution had begun reviewing all accounts carrying mixed enterprise and high operating ratios with a new scrutiny, and the Dahl Place, which had never retired its core operating debt below $180,000 over the prior 8 years, appeared in that review as a chronic underperformer. The mixed enterprise flag, the cattle, the kitchen garden, the direct market notation on the tax return, read to the reviewing committee as signals of an operation that had failed to rationalize rather than signals of an operation that had deliberately diversified its revenue away from the commodity market. The Dahl Place looked, on the balance sheet the review committee was using, like a farm in chronic trouble. Gerald filed the foreclosure notice in September, had it reviewed by the loan committee, and drove out to Cass County on the second Thursday of October to deliver it personally. Because he had met Maren twice and felt that delivering it in person was the decent thing to do. He knocked twice and told Maren she had until the 14th of November. Let me tell you what the ledger meant by November of 2009, because the number that came out of that auction does not make sense otherwise. Maren had not been idle during the 8 years since Gerald first visited. She had refinanced twice, each time to a smaller balance, using income from 3 sources Gerald had never paid close attention to. The cattle, which he considered a sentimental drain, had been slowly upgraded through careful selection to a herd of 60 Hereford Angus cross animals with exceptional marbling, which she had been selling direct to 3 independent butchers in Lincoln and Omaha at $4.80 per pound hanging weight since 2004, bypassing the commodity feeder market entirely. The kitchen garden had expanded to 11 acres under a community-supported agriculture arrangement with 140 households in the Lincoln Metro, generating $58,000 in annual pre-sold revenue. And the wheat, which the county still classed as a secondary grain crop unworthy of serious analysis, had been supplying a single bakery owner in Omaha named Vincent Park with 12,000 bushels of a heritage hard red variety per year since 2006, under contract at $9.40 per bushel, nearly 3 times the commodity price. Vincent Park was not a sentimentalist. He was a baker who had grown his 2-shop operation into 7 locations by making bread that tasted differently from the bread at every other bakery in the metro, and the difference was the flour. He was 41 years old, the son of a Korean-American family that had operated a small restaurant in South Omaha, and he had apprenticed under a German master baker in Lincoln before opening his first shop in 2001. He had spent 4 years sourcing flour from a mill in Kansas before deciding in 2004 that the commodity milling process was averaging out the qualities that made particular wheat from particular ground taste the way it tasted, and that if he wanted what he was after, he was going to have to find it at the source. He had driven out to Cass County in the spring of 2005 after tasting a loaf Maren had sent with Clara on a visit. A boule made from the heritage hard red variety Lotta had selected and saved seed from since 1948, a wheat with a higher protein content and a more complex gluten structure than commodity hard red winter. Vincent had tasted it on a Tuesday evening in his bakery kitchen, cut a slice, held it to the overhead light, and driven out the following Saturday morning without calling ahead. He stood in the field while Maren showed him the variety, a wheat with a taller, thicker stalk than modern semi-dwarf varieties, less efficient in yield per acre than the commodity strains, resistant to lodging in part because of the root depth the rotation had developed, and higher in protein by 3.5 points than the commodity specification. He had listened without notes. He had held a handful of harvested wheat and smelled it. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had offered her a 5-year contract at a price she did not try to negotiate. "Don't change anything," he had said, standing at the edge of the field with his hands in his coat pockets. She had not changed anything. By October of 2009, the operating debt on the doll place was $47,000. Gerald Pruitt's printout of the balance sheet showed $214,000 in historical high-water debt and a current note of $47,000, and he had read it as a farm perpetually in distress rather than a farm that had reduced its principal liability by $167,000 in 8 years without a single restructuring. He had not looked at the direct sale cattle income. He had not noted the CSA revenue. He had not asked about the wheat contract. He had looked at the operating ratio, found it inconsistent with monoculture benchmarks, and filed the notice. Marin sat with the ledger after he left and looked at the 2009 columns for a long time. Then she called Vincent Park and confirmed their arrangement for the following year. She called her CSA coordinator and confirmed the spring planting list. She looked at the property adjacent to hers, the 142-acre parcel that had been sitting in receivership since Tom Breckenridge's bridge loan had finally buckled in March, and she called the trustee handling that estate. The auction on November 14th was held at the Cass County Extension Building in Plattsmouth. It was a Tuesday morning, cold and overcast, the kind of gray Nebraska November day that makes fields look like they are already asleep. Gerald Pruitt attended as a representative of the bank, seated in the second row in his overcoat with a folder of documentation on his lap. There were 11 other registered bidders, their numbered paddles laid on chairs and laps around the room. Some were neighboring operators who had watched the doll place for years and assumed it would go for somewhere near assessed value, around $1,200 per acre, given the encumbered debt situation. Some were investment buyers from Lincoln, men in pressed outdoor jackets who had attended 6 auctions like this one in the past 2 years and bought 2 of them. One was a representative of a land management company out of Omaha that specialized in acquiring distressed agricultural assets and leasing them back to conventional operators. If any of them had done a search for the name Marin Dahl in the state crop records, they would have found a wheat yield that averaged 36 bushels per acre over the prior decade, while the county averaged 28. None of them had done that search. Marin arrived with Clara. She carried a folder of her own and her cashier's check in an envelope inside it. She sat in the back row and did not look at Gerald. The bidding on the 600 acres opened at $940 per acre and moved quickly to $1,380. The investment buyer from Lincoln dropped out at $1,410. The land management company's representative held to $1,550. Marin bid $1,600. The land management company bid $1,650. Marin bid $1,700. The land management company's representative looked at the room, then at his phone, and held his paddle for a long moment. He set it down. The auctioneer declared it. 600 acres. Buyer Marin Dahl at $1,700 per acre. The room was quiet for a beat that stretched longer than auction rooms usually permit. Gerald Pruitt sat in the second row with his folder open on his lap and looked at the auctioneer, then at the representative from the land management company, and then at Marin, and did not immediately speak. One of the neighboring operators in the fourth row said something quietly to the man beside him, and the man beside him turned to look at Marin and said nothing. Marin turned her attention to the next lot on the agenda. The 142-acre Breckenridge parcel came up 40 minutes later. There were fewer bidders, the ground was considered degraded from continuous corn, and the bidding was thin. It opened at $820 per acre and stalled at $1,050. Marin bid $1,100. No one countered. The auctioneer looked around the room, found no additional interest, and his hammer came down. She walked out of the Cass County Extension Building, owning 742 acres. She had paid $1,020,000 for the home place and $156,200 for the Breckenridge ground. The first figure was covered by a loan she had arranged the prior week at a bank in Omaha at 5.8% over 15 years, secured against the wheat contract, the direct sale cattle ledger, and the CSA revenue stream, all three of which the Omaha loan officer had spent 2 hours reviewing before approving the line. He had asked her at the end of those 2 hours why she had not brought this documentation to her existing bank. She had told him the existing bank had not asked to see it. The loan officer had been quiet for a moment and then approved the line, the Breckenridge ground she paid in cash from the operating reserve account. Gerald Pruitt stopped her in the parking lot. He was not angry. That is worth saying clearly, because the easy version of this story makes him the villain of the parking lot scene, and he was not. He was a sincere man who had looked at the wrong columns for 8 years and was now processing what that cost. He stood beside his sedan with his folder under his arm, and he said, "I didn't see the direct sales." Myron looked at him. "I reviewed the tax returns," he said. "I was looking at the commodity market income and the operating debt. I didn't see the direct sales." "No," she said. "You didn't." He looked at the ground for a moment. He was not a man who apologized easily, and she did not wait for him to attempt it. She got into her truck. Clara was already in the passenger seat with the purchase documents in her lap, and when Myron started the engine, she said nothing, just put the truck in gear and pulled onto the county road that led home. That was November of 2009. By the spring of 2010, Myron had begun the rehabilitation of the 142 acres she had purchased from the Breckenridge estate. The ground was compacted from continuous corn and low on organic matter, its soil biology thin from 4 years of heavy synthetic nitrogen application. She put it into a cover crop mix of hairy vetch, cereal rye, and turnip radish that first season, grazed it with the cattle herd in December to trample and incorporate the residue, and did not plant a cash crop on it until 2011. The first year it came back slow. The second year it began to recover. By 2013, she was getting 34 bushels of wheat per acre from the rehabilitation ground. Not 38, not the legacy numbers, 34 and moving upward. Clara ran the CSA from Lincoln by then, expanding it to 200 households and adding a pickup location in Omaha. She managed the wheat contract renewal with Vincent Park in 2012 at $10.20 per bushel, a renegotiation Myron had not initiated that Vincent had proposed. He wanted more bushels. Myron told him she could supply $14,000 per year from the combined acreage once the rehabilitation ground recovered its yield. They signed for 5 years. Gerald Pruitt visited the Dahl place one more time in the summer of 2013. He had left the Lincoln Bank the prior year for a position with an agricultural lending cooperative, a smaller institution that served mixed operations and direct market farms, and he wrote to Myron in advance asking if she would be willing to speak with him. She replied in 2 lines, told him to come Thursday morning. He arrived in his own car, without a company logo on his shirt. He had brought a pad of paper, and he took notes the whole time. He walked the paddocks with Myron, and she explained the rest periods and the root architecture and the moisture profile she tracked each spring with the soil probe. He asked about the wheat contract, and she showed him the contract. He asked about the CSA, and Clara explained it in the kitchen over coffee. On his way to the door, he paused and said, "I should have asked about the wheat in 2001. You should have asked about the soil in 2001, Myron said. He laughed briefly, then he nodded. Then he got in his car. In 2015, the Cass County Extension Office ran a soil health demonstration at the Dahl place. 11 neighboring operators attended. 2 of them began converting paddock segments on their own operations that fall, following a management sheet Myron and Clara had prepared from Lotta's ledger and Clara's thesis. By 2017, 4 operations in the county had adopted some version of the integrated rotation and were reporting input cost reductions between $19 and $34 per acre per year. Tom Breckenridge came back to farm in 2016 after 3 years working off-farm while the receivership wound through the courts. He had lost the 1,100 acres, but his brother-in-law had a 280-acre operation in neighboring Sarpy County that needed help. He attended the extension demonstration and sat in the back. He did not say much. When it was over, he waited until the others had gone and asked Maren if she would walk him through the paddock rotation one more time. She walked him through it. It took an hour. That is the number that matters, but let me give you the other one first, because context is what makes a number speak. In 2018, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service sent an agent named Roland Hayes from their Lincoln office to conduct a formal soil carbon assessment of the Dahl operation. He came with a soil probe and sampling equipment and spent 3 days on the property. His findings, recorded in a 5-page field report, showed that the paddocks Lotta had begun resting in 1931 and Maren had continued carrying forward, had a topsoil organic matter level of 4.8%, compared to a county average for comparable ground of 2.1%. Roland held his probe up against the light and looked at the core sample from the paddock adjacent to what he had been told was the rehabilitation ground, and he said, "How long has this been managed this way?" "Since before I was born," Maren said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing he had been trained not to say in field assessments, which was that he had not seen ground this healthy in Cass County in his 12 years with the service. The wheat yield that year, from the full 742 acres, was 38.4 bushels per acre. The county average was 23.7. Roland wrote the 38.4 in his notebook and looked at it. The county average for the prior 10 years had run between 22 and 31, with the best years clustered at the top of that range. The Dahl operation had not fallen below 35 in the same period. In the drought years of 2012 and 2017, when the county average dropped to 24 and 22 respectively, the Dahl wheat had come in at 36 and 34. The 14.7 bushel premium over county average at $10.20 per bushel under the Vincent Park contract on 742 acres was $111,279 per year in additional gross revenue compared to what the same ground would have produced at the county average and commodity price. Every year, quietly, without announcement. Roland read the number aloud from his own notes and then held very still. Maren poured coffee. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The ledger is now kept in a fireproof lockbox in the farmhouse office. Clara had the most fragile pages professionally scanned in 2016 and printed a bound copy on archival paper, which sits on the kitchen shelf between Lotta's Bible and a Kansas State soil science textbook Clara brought home from Lincoln. The original remains in pencil, 30 years of paired columns in a hand that slopes left. Lotta Dahl's handwriting, neat and small and exact. On the last page, Lotta filled in, the summer of 1961, there is a line beneath the final column that reads, "What is in the ground does not leave unless you take it out." She wrote it as a practical note, a reminder to herself about soil organic matter and the years it took to build. Maren has read it so many times the pencil has worn thin. At the 2019 Cass County Soil Health Conference in Plattsmouth, Maren sat on a panel with Roland Hayes and 2 university agronomists. Gerald Pruitt was in the audience. He had suggested to the cooperative he now worked for that they sponsor the event, and the cooperative had agreed. He did not raise his hand during the question period. He clapped with the rest of the room when the session ended. On the way out, he passed near the edge of the stage and looked at Maren. She gave him a short nod. He returned it. That was all. Clara manages the operation now. She is in her late 30s. She drives the same roads Maren drove, and she carries the soil probe on the first Tuesday of every April, and takes the same 12 cores from the same 12 points Maren marked with steel posts in 1982. She records the moisture and the organic matter and the pH in the ledger, which has a new volume now, same format as Lotta's, same sloping columns. The handwriting different, but the system unchanged. The cattle rotate through the 9 paddocks on the schedule Lotta built, adjusted each spring for rainfall and grass recovery. The wheat goes to Vincent Park's now 11 bakeries at $10.80 per bushel, the most recent contract price, a figure that bears no relationship to the commodity market, and everything to do with what the soil beneath those paddocks produces in protein and flavor and depth that the commodity market has no column for. The CSA serves 240 households. The rehabilitation ground from the old Breckenridge parcel now yields 37 bushels per acre. Within one of the legacy ground, the slow arithmetic of organic matter restoration finally settled. What the bank saw in 2009 was an operation without economies of scale, a mixed enterprise with a thin balance sheet and a sentimental attachment to old methods. What it did not see was a soil bank that had been earning compound interest since 1931, a customer relationship that insulated the wheat price from the commodity market, a livestock enterprise that had converted the cattle from an expense into a soil maintenance program funded by high-value direct sales and a record-keeping system that ran to 80 years of paired observations that no input chemistry could replicate. The two kinds of knowledge are not equally useful at every moment. In a good year, on good soil, with stable prices and available credit, the credentialed kind works well enough. It measures what is easy to count and builds what is quick to build. It performs. The trouble arrives when the season turns, when the price drops, when the rain comes at the wrong time or not at all, when the ground that was fed with chemistry instead of biology begins to crust and shed the water it needs. At that moment, the kind of knowledge that comes from 80 years of a pencil pressed to a column in a farmhouse at night, adjusting a rest period by 2 weeks because the root mass looked thin in September, choosing not to plant corn on the ground that needs another year, choosing not to borrow against a futures price that might not hold, choosing again and again the thing that could not be modeled against the thing that could be projected. What is rigid breaks. What is adapted to one particular piece of ground, learned from it over generations, returned to it in the form of rest and root and organic matter, endures through the droughts and the price collapses, and the bank officers who read only the top line of the balance sheet and miss everything underneath. Pearl, the old tricolor border collie who had worked the Dahl cattle for 11 years, passed in the winter of 2018. She had been at Maren's boot in the paddock when Roland Hayes took his soil samples, and she had been at Clara's heels the first spring Clara walked the land alone. There is a photograph of her on the kitchen wall, beside the ledger shelf, sitting on the tailgate of the truck with her ears forward and the paddock fence behind her, and the morning light coming in flat and gold across the grass that was, by then, the most alive soil in Cass County. The ground remembers everything you gave it. That is what the ledger says, in Lotta's handwriting, in the deep pencil of a woman who pressed hard to make sure it lasted. It has lasted.